Now the time has come for us to take a look at one of the main lines, at least historically speaking. And this is this, what I call the classical line with knight f3. Some of the lines, they have the very straightforward names, which are universally accepted. Some of the names, the classical, I just sort of make up as I go. This is small liberties you get to take when you've been in chess for 40 years. Feels almost scary to say this, but okay, there we go. Anyway, knight f3, the classical line. It's basically positional. White goes knight f3 very often to just proceed bishop e2 and castle short. And this has implications. The main being that we will not get sharp lines where white castles long. So basically that castling long will probably not happen anymore. So this is one thing to know. It usually leads to a quiet positional game. So play bishop g7, a standard response. And now white has a choice. The main move is bishop e2, which used to be invariably played by, Karpov and the like back in the day. But also other moves are possible. Bishop d3 is very popular online all the time. For some reason, in internet blitz games, people like to place the bishop on d3. And bishop c4 is more modern. In general, in a lot of lines, we have already seen some of those. White likes to play bishop c4. And these are basically the three moves that we will cover. Other moves here, like bishop e3 and bishop g5, they are possible, but they will lead to other lines that are covered elsewhere. So they will transpose to bishop g5 and to bishop e3 lines. So they have no place here. We will cover, those that belong in this line and sort of do not transpose to anything else. So let's start with bishop d3. It's a popular thing online and not a bad move, but there is a problem, a strategic problem with placing the bishop on d3. It's good to know that the pawn on d4 becomes vulnerable, more vulnerable than before, and you will see this very quickly. So the bishop on d3 comes with some sort of a strategic baggage, if I may say so. So black castles first. Now our next move is basically bishop g4, and for this reason white can consider playing h3, but it's a very slow approach to the opening, right? You play bishop d3, you play h3, and black has a lot of convincing ways to play here. One of them is knight c6, castles, and e5. And for a lot of King's Indian type of positions, for instance, if white plays d5, knight e7, this pawn on h3 is not great. One day, if black will start, rolling pawns on the king side, the h3 pawn will be a target. Of course, white could also do a million other things, but in general, this pawn on h3 is not useful in these structures. So I think this is enough for this line. Of course, normally white will just castle, right? I mean, bishop e3. I noticed that online people also like this because I think of the symmetry. You play bishop d3, you play bishop e3, and you have this nicely symmetrical setup that doesn't do very much. Black can go knight bd7, and then e5, and basically continue, then maybe b6, bishop b7, ed, knight c5 is one of the setups that I like. And in general, I think bishop d3, bishop e3, these moves, they sort of don't do very much. They just sort of look pretty. And normally, of course, white will probably be inclined to castle. I mean, that is why we developed the bishop, right? To be able to castle. And now the weak spot in white's position, as we already mentioned, is this pawn on d4. The e4 pawn, on the other hand, is very well protected. So we need to turn our attention to attacking the d4 pawn, and bishop g4 is a very good start. It's a pin, but it's also the beginning of the assault against this central pawn, and this pawn will be difficult to protect. The bishop on d3 is an especially awkward piece when white tries to, just defend the central pawn. It's difficult to live with this pin, so h3 will normally be played. Takes. We're not going back, right? So takes. Knight fd7. We could also go knight c6. Most of the times it will just transpose. Knight fd7 sometimes will keep an option of playing c5 before we go knight c6. So you could think of it as a more flexible way to do this. Now the pawn is hanging, and black has a lot of ways to exert more pressure on this pawn. And our aim is essentially just opening this diagonal for the bishop so that the bishop becomes more active. Now, two major ways to defend the d4 pawn. Bishop e3 is one, knight e2 is the other. So let's have a look. Knight e2 is a normal way of doing it, trying to go c3. But these pieces, they can be a bit of a liability. We'll see why very soon. So c5, c3 is normal. The center is a bit shaky even after c3. Knight c6. This pawn is hanging, and it's very difficult to do something about it without major concessions. The most important thing is that, if white moves this pawn, then black can just play knight e5, maybe get this bishop. And the most important thing is that we just clear these arrows. If white plays bishop e3, then black is basically winning after knight e5. And as I promised you, there is a tactical vulnerability of these two pieces that sometimes will play a part in this game. So white is a bit shaky here, and let's go back and see bishop e3. After bishop e3, some things are slightly different. We could, of course, also go c5 here. But we can also just go knight c6. Now white will not be able to keep the bishops anymore. I mean, these bishops are not very active, but at least, it's a pair of bishops, something white could, write home about. Although maybe this would make for a really boring letter home, right? I mean, dear family, I must report I have the pair of bishops. No, it doesn't work. So knight e2, knight b4. So we get this bishop. This bishop will have nowhere to go, but also we can take this bishop whenever we want because this pawn on c2 is hanging. This bishop is not really moving, so we have the liberty of sort of being flexible. Knight d3 is a sort of a threat, right? White will not want to end up with weak pawns on d3, d4, right? So white will probably play something like bishop g5, so as to be able to take back with the queen. c5 is normal. We're trying to open this diagonal, trying to hit this pawn, get access to this square. c3. And basically here both things are possible. We can just take the bishop, or we can even go for a more sophisticated and seemingly illogical move, knight c6. I know I promised you the bishops, and we will get them in time. But it's good to force this pawn to move first. So white cannot really protect this pawn in a long run, and white will probably play d5 now. After which we do finally take this bishop, having forced d5. And this is a good thing because it gives us access to this square e5 for the knight, opens our diagonal, and then, you know, we just play b5 afterwards, right? So I sometimes find all these arrows can be, you know, a bit much at times. So let's just remove them for now and just envisage a variation d5. I think we can also do this blindfolded. Knight e5, queen e3, takes, queen d3, black plays b5 with the idea queen b5, rook b8, and rook takes b2. So basically black gets a lot of play on the queen side, and the bishops will also disappear. So this is a story of bishop d3. As I said, it's not a bad move. It's okay. It's not great. But it puts white on the defensive a bit, because the pawn on d4 immediately starts requiring white's attention. And bishop c4 is maybe a slightly more harmonious setup, if I may. At least this pawn is less vulnerable now. The drawback of this position of the bishop is that sometimes black will be able to take knight e4 and play d5. So to begin, we will castle, just to defend this pawn first. And now this is an actual threat. And white has to react to this, or white can react to this, white doesn't have to. So first things first, for instance, if white plays bishop b3, it's very understandable. There is no knight e4 and d5 anymore. On the other hand, white needed 2 moves to get the bishop to b3. It's a serious investment when you only played 6 moves and 2 of them were to place the bishop on b3. It can be a bit much, especially here, since after knight c6, black actually has an unpleasant threat. One of these threats is bishop g4, once again hitting this pawn, and the other is more positional, is knight a5, actually getting this bishop on b3. And normally white will prevent bishop g4 by playing h3 and knight a5, and once again white will lose this bishop. It's difficult to justify the time invested for this maneuver. It took white 2 moves to bring the bishop to b3 just to sort of lose this bishop on that square. I'm not saying white is doing badly, but I think obviously black is doing well. AB, white will probably capture towards the center, and I really like b6 just to develop the bishop here, and the black has the bishops on good diagonals, and in the long term I think white will have some problems because these bishops are strong, and potentially white also has some weaknesses. I mean, this doubled pawns on the queen side, they can become weak, especially if black plays a5 at some point. This pawn will also be vulnerable. In general, I don't think this opening went well for white. So let's try to find a better move than bishop b3. Bishop g5 is an active looking move, but doesn't really have a point, because after knight e4, turns out white did nothing to stop the threat. And after the regular bishop d3 takes c5, it also turns out that the bishop is misplaced on g5. This one actually has weaknesses on d4, on b2, all sorts of things along the diagonal where the dark squared bishop could be useful defending on. on c1 or on e3, but on g5 it really doesn't do very much. So black actually gets a fantastic version of this type of position. So bishop g5 is not it either. So let's move to this position. So basically knight takes e4 is a threat, and white can try to address it with queen e2. And this is sort of a sensible setup. We encounter it in various places, but usually in a slightly more economical function, not function, no, in a more economical way, right? So for instance, we have seen this position where white goes bishop c4, queen e2, when the knight was still on g1, to go e5, e6 quickly. There is a similar position with the knight still on b1 in a slightly different opening. But anyway, these are the faster ways to play for e5. When black plays, white plays queen e2 here, playing for e5 becomes a bit late. And you'll see why. Yeah? I mean, our main line is c6. It's a good demonstration of how things can go wrong for white. Black is, amongst other things, threatening b5, maybe d5, very flexible move. Very importantly, also covers this square. We'll see why it's important very soon. So let's say white follows the plan. So the plan, bishop c4, queen e2, e5, e6, the sort of plan. Now we take, I will play knight d5. Yeah, very important. We were just in time to place the knight on d5. Now this pawn is covering it, and white is suffering from a certain disconnect between the forces in the center. Now this bishop is cut away from e6, and this is really important. White cannot play e6 anymore, and this has some serious implications, because now surprisingly this pawn turns into a weakness. It cannot run away. White usually plays bishop d2, still optimistic, defending against knight c3, preparing to castle long. Black plays bishop g4, castles long, and now we just play e6. And it turns out that white's setup is just too vulnerable. White placed the central pawn on e5, and it has nowhere to go from it, and black has an easy way to attack it. And white actually just cannot really protect the pawns in the long term. Of course, white can go h3, then take with the pawn on f3, but this will also leave white with a lot of pawn weaknesses, and in general just not a good way to play. So this is actually funny, just move 10, and white really didn't do anything wrong, it seems, and yet white has a bad position and has to sort of get ready for the long and probably hopeless defense, which shows that white has to think very carefully about playing e5, because this pawn, as we saw, can be fixed and attacked and lost. And so despite the natural look of it, queen e2, e5 is not a good plan, which leaves us with just castling, which is rarely a bad move, right? But it makes it also, it poses no problems. Black just takes on e4. And now white has a choice. Knight e4 is the normal move. Bishop f7 is maybe more ambitious, but also a bit risky. Rook f7, knight takes e4. Black has the bishops. I mean, this is the most important thing about this position. Black has the bishops, and thus black also has the future. Of course, white has certain dynamic potential here. because the knight jumps to g5 can be a bit dangerous, and the king, you could say, is maybe a bit vulnerable on g8. But we can take control of all of this, just playing h6, just controlling this square, and also preparing for the future, not immediately, for the future. One day we'll place the king on h7, we'll be super cozy there. For now, black threatens bishop g4. White will probably go h3. Queen f8, I really like this move. Black is threatening rook f3 and bishop h3. I mean, both these things are a vulnerability at the moment. White will probably move this knight, sort of, preparing for the attack, which doesn't really exist. And black has a lot of ways to play this position. You could go, bishop f5, you could go knight c6, you could play for e5 later. But also I quite like b6, because I think this will probably give you the most upside. Black tries to play bishop b7, knight d7, e5, and if everything works and the position opens up, these bishops will become so strong, and white will probably regret everything, especially taking on f7, which was, let me just go back to this position, which happened here. So bishop takes f7, maybe ambitious, but a dangerous way for white to play chess. So leaves us with knight takes e4, d5. White will go bishop d3, and white has to keep the bishops. Takes, knight d7, just preparing c5. Also the knight on f6 will be good sometimes. c3 is very normal. White tries to shorten this diagonal by sort of building some blocks before it opens. c5. It would be, of course, nice for black to recapture on c5 with a tempo. Attack the bishop. So white tries to avoid this, bishop e3, queen c7. Of course, there were some other ways to play, but I just wanted to demonstrate an easy and natural plan. The queen is well placed on c7, and the black is ready to play rook d8. Rook e1 is normal, takes. Now we are ready to play e5 after most captures. For instance, bishop d4, e5 is unpleasant. So knight takes d4 is normal. And now, I guess sometimes the square can be vulnerable in these lines where black has to worry about some things hanging. So a6 is very useful, very sort of French way to play this. There is a Rubinstein variation in the French defense which leads to similar structures, but this is like a golden version of the Rubinstein, with the bishop excellent on g7, and black is already ready to start rolling pawns and push the white pieces back. And also, from what I know on the white side of these setups, it's very easy for white to lose control and also to find any sort of a plan. Yeah, black's plans easier and better. Black can also try to play without pawn advances, play knight f6, and then develop the bishop, rook d8. So black has a really nice safe position with a lot of upside, a lot of potential. And this was the overview of bishop c4 in this position. So we are done with bishop d3, we are done with bishop c4, and I think the time has come to turn our attention to the main move, the most classical way to play the classical variation, bishop e2. So the bishop e2 move, we already know from the other two lines the main reason behind bishop e2. this is the way chess works. Even without, seeing a single thing about bishop e2 yet, we can tell, certain reasoning behind it. After bishop d3, this pawn on d4 was vulnerable. And after bishop c4, white entered into all these tricks with knight takes e4 on d5. And thus we already see that bishop e2 is maybe a more harmonious placement for the white bishop. White doesn't run into any tricks with knight e4 on d5, since there is nobody on c4. And the pawn on d4 is in a much better shape now. And bishop g4 is not a pin. So bishop e2 might look like a less active placement than the other ones, but it's much more harmonious, much safer. And this is also the reason why it was so popular for so many years and remains the most challenging move for black. We castle, white castles, and this is basically the position where black has a lot of choice for almost centuries, I wanted to say, but actually it's probably decades. Black experimented here with many different moves. Knight c6 is one, c6 another, bishop g4, all sorts of setups. And when I was playing this line with black and with white, I actually, to my embarrassment, I never realized that black has a move e5, which I only found out much later, actually, when I was preparing for this course. And then I found out that e5 is actually the easiest way to play with black. And it's actually a funny thing. In the King's Indian, which I also played my whole life, more or less, you have a very similar position, but the white pawn is on c4, and the white isn't castled there. And there e5 is the main move. So you would think that, I would also think of e5 in this position, but somehow it just never crossed my mind. And later it turned out that there is quite some theory here, and for this course I just thought e5 is so clearly a good move that we can just stick to it and keep it simple. e5 is both good and simple for black, and has been mentioned in courses for white, surprisingly enough. Grandmaster Gustafsson, he mentions this move e5 in a white course, and he says something to the effect, not literally, but something to the effect that e5 is a good move, but we hope nobody finds out. Something to this effect. And we did find out, and now we'll play it with black. So it's a wonderful thing. The thing, of course, after e5 is that tactically this pawn is not hanging. And if white takes and takes, black will be able to regain the pawn in the center. So this is, of course, a tactical justification. D takes e5 is anyway the main move. White also has some other moves. If white doesn't play d5, white could go d5, white could go bishop g5, white could go h3, all sorts of moves. So let's go and look at them one by one. So bishop g5 is one plausible move. H6 is always useful. Bishop h4, because why would you go to g5 otherwise? Knight bd7, and now this bishop is actually not that great a piece. It doesn't have many prospects on this diagonal. Sort of just looks at the knight on f6 and doesn't have any prospects on g3 either, where it runs into knight h5. So in general, just not a very good piece, the bishop on h4. And now usually white somehow ends up taking on e5, and then black has the usual plan of playing for c6 queen c7, knight c5, and the bishop just remains passive on h4. So black, soon will be better, or maybe is already a little better. So bishop g5 is really not it. And also doesn't really work together well with bishop e2, I find. I mean, this sort of bishop moves, they do not belong to the same universe, so to speak. h3 is also a similar story, I think. Like the move h3 is often played, but very often you have to ask yourself, is this move actually useful? Like, what does it actually do? And sometimes it's nice to cover g4 against knight g4 or bishop g4, but currently neither one of these moves was a threat, so h3 doesn't do very much. So we can just take and takes and rook e8. It becomes awkward for white to protect the pawn on e4, because you don't want to go f3, especially not after you played h3, which creates hideous weakening on the king side. And if you play bishop f3, then black goes knight bd7, knight e5. It's just not pretty. So it's usually a sign of something slightly wrong with your setup, where on move 8 you cannot really defend the central pawn in any nice way. So this is not great. White can also, of course, just play d5. e5, d5 is an option. And now, those of you who have King's Indian or the King's Indian, not sure which one is correct, the King's Indian defense in your repertoire will immediately notice the difference, that this pawn is just not supposed to be on c2. In the main King's Indian, you have basically the same position, but with the white pawn on c4. And the thing is that might look like a tiny difference, but in reality it matters a lot, because not just because the pawn is useful on c4, but also because white's plan in King's Indian is actually connected to the queen side, and white usually has a pawn on c4 and then plays b4 and c5 and a4, and that's where white's play is in the King's Indian. And without this, without the pawn on c4, it's just difficult for white to play somewhere. There is just no natural plan. And we can play knight e8 amongst million other plans. Just preparing f5. The knight is very useful on e8, also because just in case it defends a weakness on c7. Sometimes this pawn can be vulnerable, but not anymore. And we just play f5 next move. Basically, there is nothing for white to do here, nothing very clever. Bishop g5 is normal. f6. And now white has to decide. Bishop h4 keeps the pawn pinned. So this is against f5, so to speak. But the bishop on h4, we mentioned this already in some other positions, right? This bishop is not a great piece. It's a passive bishop, and this is also the case here. Now, black can slowly untangle with bishop h6, and there also f5, and the white bishop on h4 remains passive, and white remains just without counterplay. And it's not clear where white should start looking for any play. So bishop e3 is probably more logical, not really getting this bishop on h4 was a long-term problem, but this allows f5. f5, and black basically is ready to roll on the king side, and white's counterplay is just not there. I'm not saying white is worse, it's just way too early for this, but white will just not have an easy time generating play. Taking on f5 is not bad, actually. We take with the pawn. We'll always take with the pawn, get this powerful central pawns. Bishop takes f5 would be a mistake, just weakening this square forever. We don't want that. So we take gf, keep the pawns mobile. Sometimes we sort of threaten to roll them, maybe after due preparation. It's natural for white to go bishop g5 to avoid f4 and the bishop being locked in. The bishop f6, and now around here, maybe white should start looking for the repetition of moves with bishop h6 and bishop g5, possibly. Because otherwise, in a world where white takes on f6, queen f6, and then we play king h8, rook g8, we will probably just get a very powerful attack on the king side very quickly. And once again, where is white's play, right? I mean, this pawn is on c2, and there is no natural counterplay with c5 at any moment. So this is basically just a good King's Indian, and definitely not the way to pose any problems in this position, which leaves us with our main line. The main line is d takes e5, d takes e5. And once again, white has a choice of whether to go for the ending immediately, whether to take on e5. So he can either take on e5, take on d8, play bishop g5, and we will have to cover all these moves. Very often they lead to similar things, but sometimes there are slight differences. So let's take a look at them one by one. So the three moves in this position we need to cover. Bishop g5 is one of the more popular moves here. White does not want to take the responsibility for the queen trade. I would rather have black take on d1 so that to develop a piece for free. Its drawback, the drawback of this move bishop g5, is that black can keep the queens, and playing with the queens on, we actually do not mind. There is some potential for black here. There is quite some upside, despite the symmetrical nature of the position, right? The structure is very symmetrical. White has a pawn on e4, black has a pawn on e5. The d file is open, usually, symmetrical positions, you would say roughly equal, nothing will happen. But in the long term, black actually has some upside. This upside is connected to the fact that this knight on c3 is potentially badly placed. It doesn't look it right now, it doesn't look like it could possibly be bad, right? But you'll see how sometimes, this turns into a long-term strategic problem. So let's make some natural moves. Bishop c4 is very active, very natural. Black plays c6. This is an important moment. This pawn controls d5 and controls b5. We have encountered this pawn elsewhere in this course quite frequently. This fact that black controls these two squares automatically makes this knight a liability, a problem. This knight cannot go forward anymore, which makes it a passive piece almost by definition. And having a bad piece in your rank always has the effect on your entire position. So right now white looks active, and white can continue making active looking moves. The queen d6 is very tempting. We play queen b6, attacking the b2 pawn. And it's for some tactical reasons, e5 is not actually hanging. White actually has to take care of the b2 pawn. So bishop b3 is normal. Play queen c5. We have to take some measures because the white queen on d6 is active, and we are not losing the pawn because if we take then e4 is also hanging, right? So rook a d1 is very natural, and now go h6. bishop e3 is normal, right? Takes, and this is a funny bit. It looks like, white should be better. White is better developed. The bishop on c8, you can make it red. Rook on a8 are not yet developed and far from it. And so by all, regular reasoning, white should be doing well. But the Pierce is a very funny opening like this. Yeah, strategically, very often it's deceptive. It can sometimes lull white into this false sense of security where things are actually not so easy. So after rook e8, a very important moment, black begins to develop, right? Bishop f8, and the plan is to go bishop f8, maybe then king g7, and then knight c5. And the funny thing is that the better developed white pieces do not have actual prospects. The knight on c3 doesn't have moves. The bishop on b3 does not have moves. And they also do not have prospects, really. And the pawn on e4 is forever weak. And black has just a better central control. I mean, this tiny difference in the structure. Black has the pawn on c6, controlling vital squares, and white has this pawn on c2. That pawn doesn't do anything. Surprisingly, white starts running into trouble very, very soon. So a picture like this is what we're trying to get in this opening, where long-term control of the central squares starts to benefit us, whatever the appearances may be. So I went into some detail here because I thought this is sort of representative for the strategic picture of this opening. And now, before I lose my bearings here, somewhere deep in the description, let's return and go all the way back to the moment where white played bishop g5. So we saw this, right? Bishop g5 allows black to keep the queens and get some upside in the long run. And now let's see what happens if white actually trades the queens. Yeah, so queen d8 is one way of doing this. Rook d8. And now, again, white has a similar kind of choice, but without the queens. So can't take the pawn. Takes. Now it's important that knight takes f7 doesn't work, because knight takes c3 actually has two white pieces hanging. So I should be a bit careful about this. Knight takes e4, bishop e5. We cleared the entire center. So all these pawns have disappeared. And now we do have the symmetry, and white is maybe slightly better developed and has a move. But all in all, it shouldn't be enough and should be pretty equal. So let's look at some moves. c3. Again, can play bishop g5, which is tempting, but doesn't do anything, because rook e8 attacks, well, sort of doesn't immediately attack these pieces, but is eyeing these pieces with some intent. And white has too many things hanging, right? The pawn on b2 is hanging, the pawn on h2 is hanging, these pieces are hanging, so this is not good for white. It's better to play c3. This is always positionally desirable to limit the scope of this bishop on e5. This pawn wall, we have encountered this, and we'll see it every now and again in this opening. It's useful to shorten this diagonal, as they sometimes say. And once again, it's very important to play rook e8, using the fact that the white pieces are vulnerable on the e file, and sort of gain a tempo to get out of all the tricks with bishop g5 and knight f6, it's good to remove the rook. Bishop f3 is very likely. White will use the chance to get both pieces out of the line of fire. Knight d7, and basically it just begins to look very, very decent for black. Black's plan includes a5. Always good to get some space on the queen side. Free the rook. Maybe use it. Use the 6th rank to develop the rook. Always a pleasant way to get the rook out. But also what I really like is the plan to go bishop g7 and knight e5. Attack the bishop on f3 and remind white that the square d3 can also be vulnerable. Basically, yeah, what can I say? This endgame is pretty equal, but I do have a feeling that there is some potential, right? Especially with the square d3 being weak, you can still, outplay your opponent. Fingers crossed. So this is knight takes e5 on move 9. In this position, didn't do very much. Also here, white can play bishop g5. Now, maybe already attacking the pawn on e5 and sometimes threatening knight d5. And here also, yeah, black has a number of plausible moves. I quite like bishop g4. And after bishop g4, actually, like, why is knight d5 not a threat here? I suddenly wonder. And knight d5, we probably can just go this. Yeah, I probably should have mentioned this in the PGN for the course. Actually, it doesn't look difficult, but maybe worth a mention, right? Knight d5, knight d7 looks very good for black. And the white pawn on c2 is also hanging at the end of it. So not a worry for black. And if white takes knight e5, then bishop e2 and rook e8 also costs white material, because a lot of things are actually hanging. Yeah? So bishop g4 actually works very nicely tactically. And more than that, it also works very nice positionally after h3, which might be a bit surprising. Bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3. White has the 2 bishops. And normally you would claim, 2 bishops, the endgame advantage, but it's different here. c6, same idea as before. This pawn is vital to control the square, or both these squares. And we get the ending where I think white could easily make a mistake of overestimating their chances. Because I think in reality, black will find it easier to develop harmoniously. And I actually think black's task here is easier. Of course, white can always make a draw somehow by maybe taking bishop takes f6, but white will probably not do this, and white will end up in probably long-term difficulties. These positions are difficult to play. So the way I see it, once again, is that, we'll play knight d7, knight c5, knight e6. White will probably go bishop e3. At some point, we'll go bishop f8, bishop c5. And there, when we exchange the dark squared bishops, and we get, 2 knights against bishop and knight, that is when white will start realizing that the bishop on f3 is chronically passive, and we already know that the knight on c3 is not a great piece. So this sort of long-term strategic advantages are what we are sort of looking forward in this type of positions. White begins the endgame by, being optimistic and looking like a better side, but in reality, white is the one who has to pay attention to not get worse. So let's go back. This was the story of queen takes d8. And probably white's most challenging continuation is to take on e5 immediately. And now, okay, we have to get the move order right. It's a bit tricky. We should go knight takes e4 first. So if you go queen takes no, actually knight e4. No, if you go queen takes d1 here, rook d1. Yeah, now I'm getting it. It's just so confusing that for a moment there, I had to clarify the thoughts for myself. So if you go queen takes d1, rook d1, and knight takes e4, the problem is you run into knight takes g6, and we get into some trouble because knight e7 check, white actually wins the pawn. It's a bit complicated, so just bear with me and have a little faith. Do not overcomplicate your life. Just knight takes e4 is the way to go. Just remember this. So knight takes e5, knight takes e4. Taking on d1 runs into tactical problems. And after knight takes e4, now we safely can exchange, and in fact should exchange the queens. And this is our move order, right? Taking the other way runs into knight g6 at some unfortunate moment. So this is our critical position. So once again, after knight takes e5, here not queen takes d1, but knight takes e4. So sort of we go with a symmetry, right? Knight e5, knight takes e4. Maybe this is a good way to memorize this. And after knight takes e4, queen d1, we actually get into the ending, having sidestepped potential tactical problems. And in this position, white can take either way. In all fairness, I have to say that this position was mentioned by some other theoreticians in courses for white. But basically, these theoreticians that included some very good players, they because they were producing courses for white, they had to overplay the white chances a bit. In the reality, black has absolutely nothing to fear, as you will see. Sometimes white recommends bishop takes d1, sometimes white recommends rook takes d1, but we can take a look at both these continuations. Bishop takes d1, I think was recommended by Grandmaster Gustafsson, and bishop takes e5, rook e1, knight d7. It's really not that big a deal. I mean, of course, yeah, after c3, this bishop will find some comfort on b3 or c2, but in fact, there is nothing wrong with our position at all. a5 is always useful to sort of threaten a4. And we have encountered a very similar position already, haven't we? a4, bishop g7, the knight will come to e5, and white will have to make sure long term that the weakness of d3 does not come back to haunt them. So we have seen something very similar. It's not any different here. It was equal then, it's still equal. The other recapture on move 10, rook d1, I think is slightly more dangerous, more harmonious. Bishop takes e5. c3 is still good. Useful to build this pawn break against the black bishop. And of course, here black has many approaches. Knight d7 is very direct. Black wants to go knight f6 with sort of absolute equality. And maybe also has to be mentioned, yes, sometimes, okay, we are preparing the repertoire for black, and sometimes we have to be happy with equality, right? We cannot always get a fight. We cannot always be better, right? It would be unrealistic to expect this, yeah? So just, getting an equal ending, there's nothing wrong with this. Cannot really look for a fight in every line, in every game. It's just not very realistic. So knight d7 threatening knight f6 with the equality is a good outcome. And Anish Giri for white suggested the following really clever idea of playing bishop g5 to prevent knight f6 by covering this square, king g7, and bishop e3. So this is very sophisticated, right? To play bishop g5 and then play bishop e3. The idea, of course, is to play f4. And now the knight, the bishop on e5 doesn't have good squares to go to. And the reality is that despite the cleverness of this idea, black has a very simple and very nice antidote. Play knight f6. And white's plan is f4. And the actually quite pretty trick, which I really like this, is bishop takes f4. It's very simple, but it's yet very elegant. It looks like it's a blunder, right? It looks like it should be a mistake because the spin should normally be devastating, right? But after bishop d4, black has the move to get out of trouble, right? It was bishop e3 check. And this is actually, I just find this line, I mean, let me just replay this once again. Well, black takes bishop f4, and after bishop d4 plays bishop e3. I think there's something aesthetic about this, just it's like rotating some sort of an engine or the Rubik cube, something, it's just really funny. But anyway, returning to chess, bishop takes f4 works, and after bishop takes f4, knight e4, white will take on c7, and we will have the ending where, white has a pair of bishops. I have to stay fair and mention this, and black has a very central position with a wonderful knight on e4. And our plan includes moves bishop f5, h5 to fortify this bishop, and then rook e8, rook e7, rook a8, rook ae8. And basically, I think that the gist of it is that this knight on e4 is so strong that there is no reason for black to fear the bishops. I don't see what the bishops can do to you in this position. And I think also, potentially if white misplace their hand, there could be some upside for black in this position too. So this is the story of this ending. After knight takes e5, once again, there is the slightly confusing bit about the move order. We should take knight takes e4 and not queen d1. And once we sort of get our move orders right, maybe train them a couple of times to get them right, then we have this ending where I'm sure you'll agree black has absolutely nothing to fear. And this concludes our study of the classical line with knight f3. We basically saw bishop c4, bishop d3, and bishop e2, and black has adequate ideas and a lot of upside, I think, in all the directions. Bishop e2 was our central line, castles, e5, and here we saw, right, we can hold our ground in various endings, and in many positions with let's say bishop g5 or d5 where white avoids the endings. I actually think it's very often black who has the better chances. So I think this is enough, and I think we can move on from this variation.